Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. My name is Giulia Bottaro, and I'm joined today by Felicia Jackson and Heather Dinwoody. As ever, we're going to discuss 3 stories that we think tell us a lot about what's going on in the markets this week. So, Heather, would you like to kick off with your story?
Thanks, Julia. Yeah. So I wanted to talk today about the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, also known as the CSDDD. Neither of which is particularly easy to say. But this is a piece of EU legislation that's been in the works for a fair while now and has finally just been approved by the presidency. Now, this is positive, certainly, in that it's going to put legal liability on companies to remove environmental destruction and human rights violations from their supply chains. But it's also worth noticing that the draft that has been approved by the presidency is significantly watered down from what it had once been. This came amid sort of backlash from a few different countries. I think Germany, France, Italy were all sort of threatening that they wouldn't approve it. But it has now been passed as of Friday. But the watering down, so originally it was going to apply to any companies with over 500 employees. That has now been raised to over 1,000. It was going to be, they had to have annual turnover of 150 million euros. It's now going to be 450 million. So while the original draft would have covered approximately 16,000 companies, it's now only going to be 5,500. I also think it's important to mention that they've reduced sort of the number of activities that have to be covered. So it's also no longer going to apply to product disposal, dismantling and recycling, composting, or landfill. And the wording has been changed slightly so that instead of applying to any company within the supply chain, it's now only those that are directly, like corporations are now going to only be held accountable for those that they have really direct supply chain relationships with. And I think it's important to discuss because although, yes, it's a landmark piece of legislation, it's really demanding action, it's so watered down that it really is a bit of a disappointment, especially how hyped this has been. I also think it's slightly interesting to note that a couple of days before this was passed, the EU voted in a fair majority for a piece of forced labour regulation, which is related in that it requires companies to remove forced labour from their supply chain, but obviously it doesn't also cover the environmental aspect. And I mean, I personally think that it's sort of having passed this forced labour regulation is possibly what sort of incentivized the final approval of the CSDDD, because it would be a bit hypocritical to approve of one but not the other. I don't know what you two make of that.
Well, my thing is, I mean, I think there probably is a connection. But again, I think one of the reasons there's been so much pushback is the complexity of the data required in order to do effective due diligence. It's really, really hard. And I think a lot of industry groups have been pushing back on the need to, have everyone report on these things. But I think what's really different is that actually it's about the fact that these large companies are going to not only have to publish, but they're also going to have to implement a climate change transition plan. And actually, for me, that's the really, really interesting part of this, because we've got the reporting directives and, we've got them in the EU, and we've got, the SEC's come out in the US, and California's got its own rules, and China's bringing in ESG reporting rules. But actually, just the fact that you have to report on something and tell people what's going on doesn't mean you actually have to change anything. You're kind of relying on peer pressure. But actually, the CSDDD is saying, well, you have to publish a plan and you have to implement it, and we're going to keep an eye on you. We're going to see what you're actually doing.
One thing I will say about that was that the original draft also companies would have had to have had financial incentives behind their climate transition plan, and that has now been removed. So there's no need for executive level financial bonuses and things to be tied to the delivery of said plan. And what I also think is important to mention is that they've watered down the threshold for who this is going to apply to. based on backlash that, it's going to be too difficult for smaller companies. But the tier down, the tier who it would have applied to before, are likely sort of suppliers of the bigger guys. So it is still going to apply for them. It's really just a political thing. And I wonder if that's not what it should be. This is about responsibility and accountability. It's not about, politics.
Absolutely. But I think that's one of the big challenges that this problem faces, these issues around climate change and forced labour and, environmental and social positive action, which is that politically it's very complicated. Most people don't spend an awful lot of time thinking about how their laptop got on their desk, And look at what's going on this year. There's elections all over Europe. There's elections in the States. We're seeing quite a shift to the right in a lot of political popularity. And action on climate change and action on social responsibility is really being attacked. I mean, there's part of me that's almost amazed it got through at all, considering the backlash. Not that I'm saying it shouldn't be there. And, we do need responsibility and accountability. But I think, while I don't think politicians are necessarily acting as strongly as they should, one of the difficult things in politics and in climate change is you can't say should. It's got to be what you can get done and hope to build on it.
I suppose companies are feeling quite overwhelmed with all the regulations that are coming on in the EU. And so they're just trying their best to stop whatever can be stopped.
I mean, I do think what is interesting here is it does actually provide you with a way of understanding which companies are serious about taking action. Because Heather, you said that the requirement for compensation to be linked to action is now out of the current directive. But there are companies, you can see whether or not compensation on performance is linked to social and environmental objectives. So it's a signifier of difference between the companies that are really taking things seriously and those that are just towing the line and doing the basics that they absolutely have to. And that's a good way of telling the difference. I mean, I'm trying to see an upside here.
And I do think that's a good point to make, actually, because it sort of brings in the other factors that can combine with this, because the CSDDD is, it is going to be a massive driver for companies to start taking this action, but it's not the only reason that they will be. A lot of people... Well, I say a lot of people, when a lot of companies are already taking these steps, and part of it is because there's been an increase in transparency, because these things are now being called out not just by consumers but also by shareholders. And I actually think the CSDDD, although I'm very glad that it has passed, albeit not quite at the standard I would have liked, it's just one part of the puzzle.
But that's exactly it. We're dealing with so much complexity. There's so many different levers that we can actually pull. And I think, we have to look at the positive side of things and see that there are actually things being enacted that are trying to change corporate behaviour.
And, talking about transparency and progress, we can perhaps move on to my story, which shows how technology is really improving. It will help companies deal with these complexities. So this is a product that has been shared by Land and Carbon Lab, which is an initiative of the World Resources Institute, supported by the Bezos Earth Fund. So the point of this lab is to improve ecosystem monitoring. So they have a partner, which is the University of Maryland, which in turn has been working with NASA to develop a new land surface disturbance monitoring system known as Opera Land Surface Disturbance Alert. I know it's a lot of
Easy
words.
for you to say.
Basically, the point of this product is to monitor disturbances to any kind of vegetation cover. So that's forests, grasses, shrubs, crops occurring anywhere on Earth in near real time. So this product exists. What Land and Carbon Lab is working on is to turn this monitoring tool into an alert that can alert in real time of the changes being made. So why do we care? Why is this important? Well, this is obviously a very technical tool, but this is important in a range of ways. So first of all, currently we do have a similar product for tropical forests developed by Global Forest Watch, which alerts immediately of any changes in tropical forests, for example, deforestation. But the point of this new Opera tool is to let us know of any change anywhere on Earth. And so this is really important because it can tell us whether it's man-made. So is it a company deforesting for agriculture, or is it happening naturally, for example, by with wildfires? So, and this is really important to help us understand how the land is changing and how this might affect climate change. And so, when it comes to companies, and the reason why I was saying that technology is coming to help companies is because we have, another recently passed legislation in Europe was the EU deforestation regulation. So this is imposing on companies to tell whether their supply chains have contributed to deforestation. So this is for certain commodities, like, coffee or cocoa or soya. And so using these tools can really help with compliance and can make it very simple. And can also, there's no longer an excuse of saying, oh, well, I couldn't know. Well, yes, you can, because we've got these satellite data telling us in real time that this is happening. So I think this is a really exciting development from this week. I don't know what you think about this.
I mean, I'm a huge fan of understanding what's going on, and taking away the excuse of ignorance really should make a difference on what's going on. I think it's early days, but we have increasingly robust models of what is happening in terms of ecosystems, and the more information we have about sudden changes and what's driving those sudden changes, the more accurate our climate models are going to get, our ecosystem models are get, and that means that we're going to be able to predict more accurately where else change might happen and where we should be watching for change, and being aware of what's going on literally on the ground.
And I think that's really important in terms of prevention as well, isn't it? I mean, if you've got an area where there's, say, a lot of illegal activity or a lot of even wildfires or something natural, being able to identify those hotspot risk areas is the first step to taking action and intervening.
I think there's also potential for a better understanding of the need for adaptation and how to do adaptation successfully. Because if you look at climate finance and the capital that goes towards trying to mitigate climate change, that's where most of the money's gone, because investing in that is fairly easy to understand. It's often investing in a power project or something of that kind. In adaptation, you've often got to look at land quality and water quality and interactions across ecosystem boundaries. And of course, they all cross different country boundaries as well. So there's some really interesting potential for new ways of looking at the world around us.
I do also wonder if there's, maybe this is looking too far ahead. Well, not too far ahead, but it's looking a bit further ahead. Whether this sort of data, the type that we're collecting from, satellites and remote sensing, this can be combined with some of the social data we have, the economic data. Like, I know there are tools out there that tackle urban greening, I think it's called. So, they identify how much access certain socioeconomic groups have to trees and things like that. So I think there's a really interesting potential for all of this data to come together, and the open source nature of it is extremely exciting because anyone can use it, anyone can access it, and that means that anyone can make a positive difference. But it also means, as you say, Julia, that no one can use the excuse of ignorance.
Yeah, I think that's probably our favorite one here, because we really want companies to be held accountable, and there's nothing like numbers and figures to do that.
Well, actually, this actually brings me on to my favourite story of the week. And part of the reason, Heather, you were talking about the combining the social data with the environmental data. And I don't know if you all know about Ep6, which it's another acronym I know. But it's the model for behind the IPCC's work, and it tries to couple what's happening with the climate, what's happening with the economy, all of these different things sort of coming together. And the idea is to be able to visualize what's actually going on with climate change. And what's really exciting to me, and my story is about a company called Buzz Solutions, which has raised some money, but it's an AI-driven model, which effectively is software for predictive maintenance by getting images of what's happening on the ground and helping utilities to ensure vegetation's away from power lines and, seeing what's going on with an asset, whether it's falling apart. And the point for me is that you've got these incredibly complex global models like CMIP, but you can take those climate models and actually turn that into a useful business tool. And there's so much of this happening around industrial AI, which I'm actually really finding an exciting area. We're all reading about AI and it's ChatGPT, and some of us, we've all experienced it. It's been used to write reports or reviews or things, and you're just thinking, I have no idea where that's going. But there are companies taking these models, these complex climate models, and they're actually turning them into something useful. There's a company called Rhizome, which actually does forward climate modelling with asset data, where it can actually predict how likely it is for there to be some wildfire or hurricane or disastrous weather event around a utility. Or you've got Grey Parrot, which is AI for waste. It's actually using AI to sort through all the different types of waste and encourage recycling and reuse. You've got Cultivo, which is looking at nature-based solutions. One of the issues around nature-based solutions and the carbon credits that get generated, how do you really know what's going on? Well, if you've actually got a baseline for the vegetation and the biodiversity, you can then track that in real time using satellites. And you've got AI Dash, who we interviewed, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. They're actually looking at, again, doing baselines for biodiversity net gain. So instead of needing environmental economists, who we really, really need, but there aren't enough of, companies can actually have a real life baseline for what's going on and then be accountable for how it transforms over time. The thing about all of this stuff, when we're talking about ecosystems, when we're talking about social impact, it's so incredibly complex. And there are so many different variables involved. And actually, machine learning, AI, we can kind of model the reality of what's going on in a place and then model how it might change over time. And I just find that incredibly exciting. And the idea that we have this hardcore, reliable, robust scientific approach that's being used with robust modelling methodologies to try and see what's going on. To me, that is what's going to make investors and insurers aware of the risks around physical climate change. And once they're aware of the risks, they're going to want to know. And this brings us full circle back to Heather's story, which is if we've got machine learning that helps us manage that level of complexity and have something that's a baseline, we know where it is, and we can watch how it changes, then companies then become accountable for how they deal with that. And to me, that's just thrilling. I'm easily pleased, I admit.
I do think that there is always going to be a need for oversight as well.
Oh, absolutely.
It worries me slightly that there might end up being perhaps an over-dependence on these modelling tools and AI and everything.
Can I interrupt, though? Because one of the things that's really important about what I'm talking about is that these are tools being implemented often using CMIP, which is basically why I brought it up. And that's climate models from like 140, well, CMIP's from 49, but there are like about 140 odd think tanks and universities and research groups which have got their own models. And the reason they're different is that there's different geographies and different topologies, and depending on where you are, you're going to be looking at different information. But as long as those basic climate models are publicly accessible and publicly understood and publicly owned, then the work you do on top of that, you should be able to be accountable and transparent in that way. Because I do get your point. You do want to make sure it doesn't just get carried away with itself.
I actually think that's really fascinating in itself, because we talk about this need for standardization, so standardization of monitoring and measuring and reporting. But there is also a need for diversity, and it's quite an interesting balance that you need to strike there, because saying we need standardization, who makes that standard? Why do we decide who makes that standard? But also, it's equally unhelpful to have so many fragmented different approaches that nothing can be considered valid, because nothing can be compared against anything else.
Well, it's that problem of everything being relative. And actually, although everything is relative, it shouldn't be. That we need to have some kind of through line. And I think that's what you're talking about. Diversity is necessary because that's the reality of the physical world. It's different everywhere. But we've got to find some way of comparing apples with apples rather than apples with, I don't know, mascara.
Is there a council for AI in climate or something that meets annually? Because it sounds like they should all meet.
I'm sure there will, and I'm sure it will have a stupid acronym that no one can pronounce.
Yeah, but at the moment, think about it. Countries are still trying to work out what to do with AI and how to regulate it and how to make it work. Oh, the UK's got an AI council. Oh, no, that's for everything.
Oh, there you go. Well, I think that the EU is starting to look at regulating AI, but I think that's more from, the ethical point of view.
But that's what I mean. We're really early days.
I mean, if we think that 2 years ago, no one knew what ChatGPT was.
Oh, wasn't that a happy time?
And that's it for this section of the podcast. And in a minute, you will listen my interview with this week's guest. I am joined today by Ed Gemmell, the leader of the Climate Party, also a councillor, a managing director of national charity Scientists Warning Europe, a member of the LGA Environment, Economy, Housing and Transport Board, and just an overall politician interested in solving the climate crisis here in the UK. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us.
Hi, Julia. Nice to be here.
So this year marks a record year in terms of election globally. We've got tens of countries are facing elections. Half of the global population is going to vote. And, in the middle of this, we really need to address the big elephant in the room, that is the climate crisis. I'm saying elephant in the room because we're all well aware, but sometimes it feels that politics is not really at the forefront of addressing it. So I would really be interested in knowing more about what you do at the Climate Party and what you think that can be done from a voter's perspective, but also from a politician perspective.
Yes, as you say, we've got a big year coming now for elections and democracy worldwide, although some of those elections are in not so democratic countries, of course. But we're also, particularly as we're talking here, just recently we've heard that February was again the warmest February ever on record, 1.77 degrees above the average for February in recent years. So we're in the middle of a climate crisis, as we know. But with being in the middle of a climate crisis comes the climate opportunity. So it's absolutely clear that there is a vast opportunity for businesses and to some extent for politicians who are supporting those businesses in dealing with the climate crisis. I mean, what do we mean by that? Well, I think the latest figures that came out showed that it's in a report printed by the CBI only recently was suggesting that 92% of world GDP is now under a net zero commitment. So the direction of travel is absolutely clear. The vast majority of countries in the world have brought into law or are bringing into a law a net zero target. The majority of those are 2050, but there's quite a number of them that are bringing in earlier targets. Germany's 2045, Scandinavian countries and a number of others are 2035 and 2040. So there's a lot of earlier targets coming in. And politicians all around the world should be accepting that this is the direction of travel. There's no holding back this juggernaut now, and it needs to be moving at express speed because of the problems with the climate crisis. But even for those who don't believe in climate change, businesses need to get aligned with it because that's the direction of travel, both commercially, industrially, and financially.
Yeah, and I feel as well maybe specifically here in the UK, politics is concerned about issues like the cost of living crisis and high inflation, and they seem to there seems to be a disconnect between these issues and climate. But if we invest a little bit more in climate now, then the cost of living crisis will not be exacerbated by these problems. So is it something that you're trying to address at the Climate Party?
Yes, absolutely. And to be honest, you could probably be talking about us as the Climate Opportunity Party, which might actually phrase what we're doing more succinctly. I think there's two aspects of it. I think the way you were talking about it is the traditional way we have talked about it, and that's that there is great cost coming if we don't deal with things early, and it's better to deal with it now because it will cost us less. I think there is in which case, if we leave it, it exacerbates cost of living crisis, drives inflation, etc. But I think there's a much more obvious thing than that, and that's that this vast opportunity that is laid out in front of us from an industrial, commercial, and business point of view is that everyone's going there. It's absolutely clear that the world is in a race to get to net zero, with some going slower and some going faster. But everyone is actually going in that direction. And so for any individual company or individual country, there is a huge commercial and industrial opportunity. And what Britain should be doing is pulling forward its net zero target by decades to make sure that it gets a national mission to move forward business and the opportunities in industry in this country, and actually starts to make money for Britain PLC. If we make money for Britain PLC, there's more money to actually deal with the cost of living crisis, put money into the NHS, fund the police properly, fund our social services. At the moment, politically in the UK, we are managing our decline. So what's happened is the Conservatives are talking about doing things that are financially responsible, whether or not we regard the new budget as financially responsible or not, but they talk about it being financially responsible. And in fact, what we should be doing is putting vast investment into the industries of tomorrow. So what we should be doing is getting huge public investment going that will generate multiples in terms of private investment to drive through British leadership of the clean industrial revolution. If we actually do that, if we drive that investment, if we bring forward our net zero target to 2030 or something similar to that, we galvanize the whole of Britain, we galvanize finance, industry, innovation, and we have a national mission that drives us towards a point where we have more money to pay for everything else.
Sounds like a really pragmatic approach. So if I'm not wrong, the Climate Party sits on the right of the center. Is that correct? So a very business-centric, market-focused approach.
Yes, I mean, we're very much a sort of central pro-business, pro-climate party. We talk about ourselves as being centre-right, but we're probably more central because what I've just said is pretty clear and obvious to any sort of right-thinking people. And it doesn't matter whether you're an industrialist businessman or a trade unionist, they would all want to follow what we've just suggested. So it's really pretty central. The reason for saying we're centre-right is to immediately distinguish ourselves from the Green Party, because we've got an election coming up, and to land for everybody that we're absolutely not the Green Party, which heavily sits on the left in terms of action on climate and industry, and talks about degrowth. We are absolutely not that. So we talk about ourselves being centre-right to distinguish ourselves. I think it's worth as well, noting why this is something that works for voters both on the left and the right. And as I say, it doesn't matter whether they're trade unionists or they are businessmen or entrepreneurs, is Britain has been losing out now for decades. Back in the 1970s, British manufacturing was probably 30% of our national product, of our GDP, something like that. And that has continuously declined over the course of these previous decades, down to being under 10% now. At the same time, we have come to the point where we sell less stuff, export, than we buy in. So we're buying more stuff from China and everywhere else than we're exporting. And that includes both goods and services. And we have been running what's called a trade deficit now for more than 25 years. So Britain has been losing money and borrowing more heavily to fund itself losing money every year now for decades. I mean, we're paying something like 8 billion per month in terms of interest payments due to the borrowings on our trade deficit. And that is for no gain. So we're not talking about borrowing a large amount of money to putting it into industry, into the new, tomorrow's technologies, into investment for tomorrow's world. That's just keeping us going because our balance of trade is negative. So, and that's when we do well in services anyway. So what we need now is to borrow and or raise money through other systems and to drive private investment. So we get a huge chunk of money over the next few years invested in tomorrow's industry and technology, drive manufacturing in this country. That doesn't mean smokestacks and overconsumption and pollution, because it's about the clean technologies of tomorrow. And whether it's renewables, whether it's nuclear, if it can be done quickly enough, whether it's wave, tidal, ecotech, agro-ecotech, whether it's AI systems that make things more sustainable and more efficient, we need massive investment in all of these businesses of tomorrow now.
So taking a little step back, talking about the Green Party, what do you feel was missing in the Green Party manifesto and, general plans that you are filling with the Climate Party?
Okay, well, in general, what's missing with the Green Party is what's missing with all political parties in the UK is lack of focus. So they're focused on every single issue that happens to be going. They've got an opinion on everything. And that means lack of focus on the biggest issue of the decade, not the decade, the century or the millennia, which is dealing with the climate crisis and commercially grabbing the opportunity that goes with it. So lack of focus is number one. I think in relation to climate and environmental business and environmental industry, then because the Green Party is focused and talks about degrowth, so as in use less and have less, then to some extent that's not resonating with business and industry or with voters at the moment. The Green Party also recently in their last conference decided to move back from their commitment to 2030 to say that they would be looking to decarbonise the economy just within 10 years. So they've rowed back on what would be a scientifically defensible target for decarbonisation, which would be 2030, but which is also a clearly defensible target commercially, because it brings us ahead of all the other countries and gives us a first mover advantage in an industrial sense as well.
Yeah. I think that the degrowth issue is very thorny, and there is perhaps a bit of confusion around what it means, because I don't think, my impression of it is that it doesn't mean that we should just have less or consume less. Is we need to ensure that the right industries grow. So the ones that, probably the ones that you mentioned, so AI for the service of sustainability or clean tech, they should grow, and then the polluting ones should be limited. I think that's my vision of it.
I don't think that is the way. I mean, and that's clearly correct anyway. That's what we all expect. So we all want to see a reduction in those things that are actually destroying the planet, such as fossil fuels, both extraction and use of it in dirty industry. And we want to see the growth of clean industries. But the focus is all wrong. So, the minute you talk about degrowth, what you're really talking about is a degrowth of consumption. So you're talking about having less consumption within your economy. But that's not the right way to be looking at it. It's about, as you have just summarized, and I don't think that's the way the Green Party regards degrowth, by the way, but what you've summarized is actually we have growth of consumption of the right things.
Yeah.
So if you decarbonize your economy for the sake of discussion by 2030, then on the 1st of January 2031, you can be consuming things and they are already decarbonized. They're not causing damage to the planet in terms of emissions. And in terms of sustainability, they will be circular or almost circular, because that's one of the main ways, of course, that you're going to stop carbon emissions going into the atmosphere when you're producing things in the first place. You make them more circular.
Yeah, I mean, we do consume a lot of things that we shouldn't, though. So I think it would be important to reduce consumption to some level, and this includes the use of plastics, for example. So looking ahead at the upcoming elections, how do you think you're gonna fare?
Well, I think looking at what our intention is, and it's been said quite publicly, so there's no secret here, our strategy and not our politics is UKIP for climate. We've clearly stated our aim is to put pressure on the two main political parties, Labour and the Conservatives in the UK, that we will take votes away from them if they don't bring their targets for net zero and for driving sustainability forward. So we're going to stand against them until they steal our ideas, which we want them to do, and adopt our targets. We will take away votes from them. Our target is to go for the marginal constituencies of both. So the target is the top 100, 110 marginal constituencies, on the basis that every single vote there that they can't get is a danger to them that they won't get in. So we're targeting those marginal constituencies, and we're going to threaten those potential MPs, those candidates, of taking away votes from them. And then it doesn't matter if it's a vote, 1,000 votes or 10,000 votes. Each vote that comes to us is saying climate is the most important issue, both in terms of safety for us and our futures, and in terms of the economic opportunity. And we're not going to give our vote back to those old parties until they get with the plan and start moving forward those targets. So that's the main aim. The secondary aim, which is again been clearly stated, is we're changing the dialogue. So we are opening up the Overton window, we're moving it forward. So we're moving forward the discussion by being at the point end of saying this is so obvious, this huge commercial and industrial opportunity, and we're out there saying it in the news. I'm often in the television and in other, in media, talking about it, as are others in the party, and we're out there pushing out the boundaries, telling people about the opportunity, and others are coming behind us. So you've seen various things happen in the UK over the last year or so. The Mission Zero report from Chris Skidmore, which talked all about the opportunities, although was not ambitious enough in terms of timing, so didn't bring forward the targets enough. You've then had a report come out by Nick Stern and others only about a month ago, talking about the fact that we need 1% of GDP being invested in the new clean technologies of tomorrow to drive industry. Again, very conservative, and the report comes out within the context of the current discussions. And then another report, the CBI and ECIU report that came out only, 10 or 12 days ago now, and that was talking about the fact that the net zero economy in the UK is currently growing at about 9%, whereas our overall economy is only growing at 0.1%. So in fact, the net zero economy is growing 90 times faster than our current economy. And if we want to have an economy that's producing money for all of us, then we need to get with it and start exploiting the net zero economy quicker. So the second part is changing that whole media dialogue, being out there at the front, talking about it in a clear and ambitious and necessary way, allowing others to come behind us. And then third is we'll take seats. So when you're talking about myself, I'll be standing in High Wycombe against the country's number one climate denier or climate skeptic politically, which is Steve Baker, who formed the Net Zero Scrutiny Group in Parliament, so the climate skeptics group of the Conservative Party, and has consistently gone out trying to delay action and delay investment into clean tech and the technologies of tomorrow. So I will stand specifically against him. And I have been offered funding from various sources within and outside the constituency in order to try and dislodge him. So anybody listening want to come and fund the campaign in Wycombe or the Climate Party, please do get in touch, and we'll try and dislodge one of the top climate deniers in the country. So we've got three aims: move those parties forward on what they're doing, move forward that media dialogue and the dialogue around the opportunity, and then take votes.
I'm really interested in knowing how the voters are reacting in your specific constituency, because they voted a climate denier, right? So that would be quite a big change to then vote for you. What are the reactions when you're campaigning?
I mean, the campaign to some extent has only just started in the constituency. It may be more interesting to talk about Uxbridge, because I stood in the Uxbridge by-election 6 or 8 months ago, and we played this out for 3.5 weeks in the street with probably more than 1,000 constituents as we were campaigning. And when we went through with people in the street, and these are not economics graduates from Oxford or Cambridge, these are normal people in all sorts of walks of life, ages, etc. And we're saying to them, look, we all want money for the NHS, the police, social services, and all the things in Britain that we want to happen. And there is no money available. And the only way we're going to get more money is investing hard, working hard for 5 or 6 or 7 years, and starting to see more money being created in Britain that can pay for these things in the future. And the most obvious place to go for that is clean tech and dealing with the climate emergency, because everybody is going there, because we can see it all happening. The world has dedicated itself to it, and we need to get ahead, do it all in Britain, then we can sell it on to everybody else. When we sell it on, we make money and we can pay for all these things that we want funding. And in the street, the normal man and woman in the street goes, oh, that is so obvious. Why don't the politicians get it? Well, the reason the politicians don't get it is because what they're thinking about is 1 month ahead or 6 months ahead and their own position. They're not out there with a big vision trying to do what's right, either for the country or for the economy. It's for themselves.
So it sounds like an immediate buy-in from the people you've spoken to in the street.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the critical bit in terms of electoral success, and as I explained our strategy, we can be successful without having electoral success, because the success is Britain grabbing the climate opportunity and leading it. It's not about Ed Gemmill becoming prime minister. But to have electoral success, then we're going to need people also to go, right, I don't buy into the two-party system. I'm going to withdraw my vote. I'm going to vote on this particular issue and show that I care. Interestingly, the recent Rochdale by-election, where a non-main party candidate won from a very minor party, followed by an independent. And between them, they got 60 or 70% of the vote. So the first and second were not in any major well-known party. And that shows that people are ready to not vote for the major parties if they have somebody local who's interesting, credible, and they think might be able to represent them. So I think this is the best opportunity for decades for small parties or independent candidates to really make inroads. And it's very important because since 1950, we've had something like 10,000 members of parliament elected. For the 14th one that was elected who wasn't from a major party, and that includes the Green Party and small parties. So the 14th person to be elected out of roughly 10,000 since 1950 was elected at Rochdale. So the chances of a small party or an independent getting in is pretty low generally, but the atmosphere at the moment gives a much better opportunity. And very recently, I've been involved in a council by-election, the Buckinghamshire Unitary Council, but supporting an independent candidate. And it happened many times on the doorstep that people said, I don't believe in politics, want nothing to do with it. I don't believe in politicians, I want nothing to do with it. It's all disgusting. And then when you say he's independent, they want to talk. And they want to talk because actually what they're saying is, I am disgusted with the main parties. I don't know who to believe. There's too much lack of integrity. There's too little vision. There's too little leadership. I don't like all of the things that have been going on, the shenanigans that have happened behind the scenes. I'm just fed up with it. And then you talk about a new kind of politics, which is independent or small party. And that from the climate party's perspective, we have one focus. And on every other issue, I, as a candidate, can be independent. I'm not whipped or told what to do by a party. So on climate and the climate opportunity, all of us believe the same thing in the climate party. But on everything else, if it's on how to work with the NHS, if it's on dealing with local transport issues and everything else, we can work with local people to get the best outcome for them. And people like that at the moment because they are disillusioned with Labour and the Conservatives and the other main parties.
Yeah, so they want someone that they really feel is working for them.
Yes, and they can connect to. And it doesn't matter whether you're at a parliamentary level or a council level, what can happen is you go to your local parliamentarian or your local councillor and you say, I need some help on this. And your local councillor or parliamentarian may want to help, but they may then get squashed by their party and told, I'm sorry, that doesn't accord with party policy. You can't do that. And as a councillor, I have had times where I have been working with a councillor from another party, and I'm an independent councillor, and they've been saying, we're trying to do it together, and then they've come and said to me, I've been told not to do it, and they have to stand back, and then I have to work on it on my own because they're not allowed to.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks for the explanation. I think that's our time, but thank you so much for talking to us today. And it was a real pleasure to get to know more about what you do. And we shall see how the party performs at the election.
It's a pleasure, Julia. I'm delighted to be here. And if any of your listeners want to get in touch, come and support us, join us, volunteer, donate, or even become a candidate, please can they get in touch with us? And the website is www.theclimate.party.
Amazing, thanks. And we'll add links in the show notes as well so everyone can see. Thanks again to our followers. Don't forget to follow us on our social media and newsletter, and see you next week.